Here's an interesting thing, Johnson. So he talks about man is equipped with senses and consciousness like other living beings, but having mind and reason rises above those baser things to the realm of the immaterial. And to quote him, he says, man's thinking and knowing, although bound to the brain, is itself in its essence entirely a spiritual activity, rising above the things he sees with his eye and feels with his hand. So like when I read this sort of thing, it's I have a lot of questions about like the brain and how that relates to our souls. And then I also, I also kind of got, like some Plato vibes here because he's kind of like, Plato's got like his forms, and also there's like the chair, but there's like the perfect, and I know a lot of people credit Augustine with, or say that Augustine took a lot of his thinking from
Sure.
Plato, where everything that's in this material world are just the shadow of the true essence of the realities of
Yeah.
those items. And so it did kind of, when I thought about the brain and this kind of thing, I did think about kind of those Platonic forms that exist out there, and then also God Himself.
Mhm.
And so I don't know if you have any thoughts on that. And then that's the first thing. And the second thing is like the relationship between the brain and like the spirit.
Yeah.
We talked about we're not disintegrated beings. We are integrated beings. If I have a headache, it's really hard for me to pray.
Right.
If I have been taking my medicine, I'm going to be more irritable or whatever the case may be.
Sure.
So yeah, if you could maybe speak to just kind of for those that are intellectually inclined, kind of itch their scratch a little bit as it relates to like Plato and
Sure.
this type of thing, and then obviously God too, because uh, also in Hebrews, like God talks about like the temple, or in Hebrews it talks about the temple, and it says these are sort of earthly things, and they're a shadow of the true form of the realities,
Right.
which is like God's glory in heaven. And I'm not saying that heaven is set up like the earthly temple was or the earthly tabernacle was.
Mhm.
But anyway, it does kind of have like a Platonic vibe to it. So
Sure.
anyway, I just want to know if you wanted to kind of speak to some of that.
Yeah, no, those are great thoughts. I what caught my eye was him saying that, the thinking and knowing are entirely a spiritual activity, and I was wondering if I actually agree with that, um, and I was wondering that for, I think, reasons that you're stating, like, um, you know, if I don't take my medicine, I can't necessarily, some people, myself included, if I don't take my medicine, I can't always rely on my thinking. It can be inaccurate thinking, for various reasons. And, what if you have a headache, or what if you're hallucinating for whatever reason, or what if you're dreaming, and your mind goes and conjures up all sorts of things. So there's all of these instances I can think of, related to the mind, that don't really come across to me as being entirely spiritual. Um, and at the same time, I still think I agree with what he's writing, because, I think what's going on is he is actually sort of working through what a incomprehensible thing it is to think, to comprehend. Meaning that, like, if you're like, "Here's what it looks like when I run." Well, I could watch you run and be like, "Oh, yes, that's what running is." But when it's like, "Here's me thinking," there's not it's not like I can see that. It's not like I could hook you up to a computer and then see those thoughts. It's like almost defies definition or even explanation that in, seconds, our mind just conjures up thoughts that form everything that we do. And the scripture over and over addresses this, usually by referring to the heart. But even, understanding, like, that our primary calling in life is to love the Lord our God with all of our heart, strength, soul, and mind. um, we realize that, yeah, our thinking and our knowing is a spiritual activity. We're supposed to be thinking and knowing under the lordship of Jesus Christ, or under the godness of God Himself. We're supposed to have all of our thoughts, I guess, to put it in the context of what we're speaking about here, supposed to have all of our thoughts under the reality that God Himself is our greatest good, that our satisfaction will only be found ultimately in Him. And so I think that's what he's saying. I don't think he's um, saying, you know, aberrations in thought can't be fixed with medicine, or there's no place for therapy, or don't take aspirin if you have a headache. I don't think he's getting there at all. I just think he's saying, while thoughts are tied to the brain, there's something going on with your thinking that, in a real sense, it's between you and God, and between you and God alone. Nobody else is going to see your thoughts, but He does. Um, and that thinking is like the central place for worship. That ongoing assessment: is this worthy of my worship? It's like we go through life, in a sense, asking that question and finding things unworthy of worship that we worship anyway, which is called idolatry. And then through grace, by faith and the Holy Spirit, we find God, we find our rest in Him, and we see that He's worthy of our worship. And in that sense, thinking is entirely a spiritual activity.
Gotcha. So like in that last point, are you basically saying that to the extent that our thoughts are directed towards God, or to the extent that the thoughts are being properly executed, in that sense that they are purely spiritual?
Yeah, I think, the expression like coram deo, which is like before the face of God. Um, that I think that's the idea, is like, going back to God in the living room, or God as your loving Father, God as Abba Father. If you're living saying like, "Oh no, He's gonna see me if I sin, or He's gonna like smash me if I sin, or if I do something really wrong, He's gonna flick me away into hell forever," that kind of thing. There's no way that you could live before Him as a loving Father if those are your thoughts. And so I think the idea of every thought being spiritual activity is more like, I understand that I am always before the face of my loving Father in heaven. Everything I do, even every thought I have, even all of my sin, it's all in front of the Lord. Um, and so that's why, I confess my sin. That's why I say, forgive me my debts as we forgive our debtors. And um, but yeah, just always before the Lord's face, and realizing that I might think my thought life is private to myself, but it's actually between me and God. And that's not an upsetting reality for me, because um, He forgives me of where I sin, and grants me grace and strength to uh, endure and persevere into better and better obedience, again, by grace. So I think that's what's going on. But I agree, and I agree that it stood out to me as well. And I wouldn't want anybody to think that, oh, you have a some sort of a struggle related to your brain, and you shouldn't take medication for it, and you shouldn't see a therapist for it, you shouldn't see a psychiatrist. It's just a spiritual issue. I don't agree with that train of thought at all. So
Yeah, and thank you for. I know we didn't get into the platonic aspects, but in terms of our thoughts, it's like it's been a mystery, for a long time, that people have wondered, how can I tell my arm to move? And various philosophers have speculated on it. And even though I would say that at this point, we can, if I'm sure if you had like some sort of like fancy microscope, you can probably peer into the brain and watch electrical signals and see various hormones being released as you think certain things. But as to how that formulates itself into like words in your mind, and then those things into whole form thoughts and so forth, it's I don't know that even like the most modern medicine understands unexplained with the $6 million man. What's his name? I don't know if you've heard of that show. Or do you know the $6 Million Man?
I think I have an idea of what it is, but I don't know it specifically.
Okay, well, it was like an old show, and it starred this guy. I can't remember what his name is, but he's doing this show, The Unexplained. I think they're doing it on the History Channel,
Okay.
and I just really love it because because they're always looking at different mysteries in life, and they're looking at different stories, and it's like got no idea. And so I watched the one on the brain, and it's just like some people can tend to they understand things that they shouldn't. They can communicate to other beings in ways that it gets really wild. And so um I you know I perhaps perhaps society used to be too like single focused on a certain part of our personhood, so that
Yeah.
would be like our souls and our spirit, and maybe to the neglect of our body and things like that. And nowadays, we might be so far on the body side, especially in kind of secular culture, that we neglect the other aspects of the human, which is like the soul, the spirit, mind, whatever that might be.
Sure.
But I do take comfort if you peel back the layers far enough, like you can't really identify where a thought is,
Right.
um, and that there are still things you can't explain from a pure material standpoint. So yeah, I think, there are dangers of emphasizing one part of the human being to the neglect of the other parts of the human being. We can err if we
Yeah.
neglect any aspect of our humanity
Right.
and diagnosing and assessing like the situation properly.
Yeah, I think, something of an analogy, like whatever your favorite piece of music is, for example, we could just use, like, Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. But if we tried to explain how amazing Beethoven's Fifth Symphony sounds by speaking about how the different instruments were made, we would never come close to describing how amazing Beethoven's Fifth Symphony sounds. It's never going to be the sum of the parts. It's never gonna be like, well, if you pluck this string at a quarter of the way down and, then pluck this other string at this point and then blow into an instrument here, and it's never gonna be like, "Oh, that's as beautiful as Beethoven's Fifth Symphony." And, um, that's how I feel about the human body. It's like, I don't understand it at all. I don't believe anybody really does. Like, this matter in your head that we call a brain is absolutely essential to thoughts, but the thoughts that we have are greater than just sort of thoughts that a brain has. So we can think about grand things. We can be inspired by music or by heroism or by a story. We can be caught up in love with somebody. We can be overwhelmed with the beauty of something. Um, and I do, even if we switch it to something more, it seems related to the body, like a broken leg, we all understand that there's the physical difficulty, a broken leg, but then so very tied to that is somebody's attitude over a broken leg. And what is that attitude? Like, is that um, it's just a very evasive thing to even begin to describe thoughts, disposition, a personality, how you handle truth, or how you handle a handicap, how you handle something that's wrong with your body, whether it's you know uh, being deformed or having cancer or some disorder or whatever the case might be. It's like it's always much bigger than just the body, and I think that much bigger than just the body is sort of another way of saying spiritual activity.
Yeah. Yeah, it's, if you kind of look at the human body and say that it is purely material, I do think that there are things that you're not going to be able to explain, or you're not going to understand the body properly. That this body, the body says that where there is a physical body, there is a spiritual body. So, but I also think that if you look at the body purely as a spiritual thing,
Mm,
and not from and not a physical thing also, then you will also err. Um, and and so, you do have to kind of understand, in order to have a complete view, you have to kind of see all the different parts of what it means to be human. And and there's no there's no contradiction there. Like, in James, James says, what good is it if someone comes among you and they're like hungry and poor, and you say, go away in God's name and be filled and be blessed, and
right.
you get on out of here and just go there, and God take care of you. We'll pray for you, but you don't give them the things necessary for the body. That is worthless.
Yeah.
And so, um, yeah, it's I think we can take comfort in understanding this duplicitous. I don't know if it's duplicitous, but this dual nature of our beings, that we are spiritual beings, and at the same time we are also absolutely tied to this earth
Yeah.
and what it means to be physical. And
Yeah.
so I think in neglect of either of those can lead into some bad approaches.
Yeah. Yeah, it's well said. That's exactly right. And hunger and thirst are great illustrations. If somebody said, "I haven't eaten for days, would you please pray that God take away my hunger?" I would say, "Yeah, I'll pray for God to take away your hunger as I give you food for the Lord to use to take away your hunger." And
Yeah,
I think we have to be very cognizant of that and very forthright about that. And and just see, like, yeah, there is this dual reality that we are spiritual, physical entities integrated together. We can't say that we're just physical and we can't say that we're just spiritual. I try to shy away from saying anything that sounds like everything is a spiritual issue. I don't think that's accurate. What I would say is there's a spiritual dimension to every issue for us as people. Like there's a spiritual dimension to how you consider your hunger or your broken leg or your diabetes or whatever the case might be. But no, it's not entirely spiritual. It can be more physical than you're first thinking. And I think that often proves to be the case. Um, but, to circle back and just make the point that it's not entirely physical and merely physical, if you mix baking soda and vinegar together, there is a chemical reaction, and you could say, I think you could safely say that that is a physical reaction and not a spiritual one. It's two physical chemicals reacting together, and the baking soda isn't like thinking about what's going on at that point and trying to live before the face of God and wondering whether or not it's sinful or not. And in that sense, vinegar and baking soda is very different from us because everything we do, we're like, should I do this? Shouldn't I do this? Can I live up to other people knowing that I did this? Can I live with myself knowing that I've done this? How do I tell somebody else what I did and why I did it? Is there a God? Does God see what I do? What does he think of what I do? What kind of God is it? We're just like constantly fraught with spiritual dimensions to our every situation in a way that animals aren't, and certainly chemicals like baking soda and vinegar just aren't. And I
yeah.
think that's I think that's what Bavinck is getting at. Just like here's here's part of the fascination about being human. Um, our thinking has a spiritual quality to it at every point.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that, like, if you're trying to, if you I know for me, I do find encouragement, like I mentioned that show. In a weird way, I do find encouragement that the brain and or the soul cannot just be simply explained away and purely physical things. There are still, and I can't list them all off right now, but there are still realities and mysteries that you just simply cannot explain. I would point you to that episode,
Sure.
and the reason why I like it is because the episode of that unexplained is because it's it says to me, it signals to me that it's not just purely material, because I think a lot of people look at the human brain and they're like, wow, that's we have a supercomputer and every emotion is being controlled by hormones, and every thought is even geared by hormones, or whatever you want to kind of, whatever particular thing you're looking at to explain why the brain does what it does or why humans do what they do. Those things, there's probably some validity to that, but it's still not enough to fully explain everything that humans do, or how we think, or why we think. And so, yeah, I would just encourage you, if anyone is out there and they sort of have a very materialistic standpoint where everything can be explained purely by the human brain, for example, if you look at it deep enough, and you peel back the layers, you're gonna start to uncover things that I don't believe simply can be explained by just merely physical explanations.
Yeah.
And go ahead, Jonathan.
What was the episode that you were recommending again?
Oh, yeah, the show is called The Unexplained, and
Okay.
the episode is just on the brain. So
Okay.
it gets pretty wild. But as a Christian, I
Yeah.
get some feels off of it, because it's like, oh yeah, like we cannot explain everything from a
Yeah.
purely material standpoint, which I feel like in our culture is a lot of people just try to do. If we could just understand a little bit more. Because I remember like Bill Nye, back in the day, he's just like, we're so close. We're on the brink of, and we just got to push a little bit further. And Bobbing's going to talk about that later on in this passage. That has put eternity into man's heart, and we'll get there. But God's put eternity into man's heart, that because this the futility of the continued pursuit and search of knowledge, and just this reality that you will never plumb the depths
Right.
of things.